In the next few minutes, you're going to understand why a phrase most people have barely heard could become the fault line of global politics in 2026, why markets are already quietly repositioning, and why history suggests that when great powers redraw invisible lines on the map, the collision rarely announces itself with a single explosion, but with a series of moves that seem logical right up until they're irreversible. What's being called Trump's Donroe Doctrine is not just a slogan or a soundbite, it's a way of thinking about power, borders, money, and control that echoes an older American idea while reshaping it for a world where economic warfare can hit harder than tanks, and where silver, oil, and shipping lanes can matter as much as missiles. The name itself hints at its roots, blending Donald Trump's America First worldview with the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, when the United States declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to European empires. Back then, America was a rising power, relatively weak militarily but confident in its future, and the doctrine was as much a warning as it was a statement of ambition. Fast forward nearly 2 centuries, and the global situation is inverted and compressed. The United States is no longer the upstart, it is the incumbent power facing challengers that are economically integrated, technologically advanced, and strategically patient. The Donroe Doctrine, as analysts describe it, is less about hemispheres and more about spheres of influence defined by trade, routes, resource control, financial systems, and security guarantees. It implies a harder line on who gets to operate where, who gets access to which markets, and who controls the choke points that keep the global economy moving. To understand why this sets up a collision course, you have to look at how Trump's strategic instincts have always worked. During his first presidency, tariffs were not just economic tools but geopolitical weapons. Steel, aluminum, technology components, and energy products were all pulled into a broader contest over leverage. The logic was simple. If the United States could make access to its massive consumer market conditional, it could force rivals and allies alike to renegotiate terms. The Donroe Doctrine takes that logic further by tying economic pressure directly to security red lines. It suggests that certain regions, from critical sea lanes to resource-rich zones, are no longer neutral spaces of global commerce, but contested arenas where American power will be asserted more explicitly. This matters because great power conflict in the modern era rarely begins with soldiers crossing borders. It begins with policies that redefine what is acceptable behavior. When one power declares a new doctrine, others are forced to respond, either by accommodating it, testing it, or openly resisting it. In financial markets, this shows up first as volatility and repositioning. Investors start asking uncomfortable questions. What happens to global supply chains if access to key regions is restricted? What happens to currencies if trade flows are disrupted? And what happens to real assets like gold and silver when trust in political stability starts to erode? Historically, periods of rising geopolitical tension have coincided with renewed interest in precious metals. Gold is often described as a store of value, but silver plays a dual role that makes it especially sensitive to great power rivalry. It is both a monetary metal and an industrial one, used in electronics, solar panels, and military technology. When nations prepare for strategic competition, demand for silver doesn't just come from investors hedging risk, but from industries ramping up production. If the Donroe Doctrine signals a more confrontational stance toward rival powers, especially in technology and energy, the knock-on effects could be significant for silver markets already facing supply constraints, from declining mine grades and underinvestment. The collision course narrative also depends on timing, and 2026 is not an arbitrary date. Election cycles, military procurement timelines, and infrastructure investments all converge around the middle of the decade. Policies announced in one term often take years to fully materialize. Trade agreements are renegotiated, sanctions regimes are expanded, and strategic partnerships are reshaped. By 2026, the cumulative effect of these decisions could force other great powers to choose between accepting a U.S.-defined order or pushing back in ways that risk escalation. This is where history offers a sobering lesson. Before World War I, no major power believed it was choosing catastrophe. Each believed it was protecting its interests, enforcing credibility, and deterring rivals. The system broke not because of one decision, but because doctrines hardened into ultimatums. Another critical element of the Donroe Doctrine idea is energy. Control over energy flows has always been central to power, and in the modern world that means oil, natural gas, and increasingly the materials that enable renewable energy. Trump's emphasis on energy independence, domestic production, and strategic reserves fits neatly into a doctrine that prioritizes self-sufficiency and leverage. If the United States signals that energy security is non-negotiable, it can justify aggressive policies toward regions and actors seen as threats to that security. For rival powers that rely on imported energy or control key transit routes, this creates friction that extends far beyond economics. Markets tend to underestimate how quickly sentiment can shift once doctrines turn into actions. A new tariff here, a naval deployment there, a sanction package framed as defensive, and suddenly the assumptions underpinning global trade look fragile. Currency markets react, bond yields adjust, and commodities move. Gold often rises on fear, but silver can spike on both fear and industrial demand, making it particularly volatile. For everyday viewers, this might sound abstract, but it affects inflation, interest rates, and the cost of living in very real ways. When global powers clash, even indirectly, the price you pay for energy, electronics, and basic goods can change almost overnight. The idea of a collision course doesn't mean war is inevitable, but it does mean the margin for error shrinks. Doctrines simplify complex realities into guiding principles, and while that can clarify strategy, it can also lock leaders into rigid positions. If the Donroe Doctrine frames certain regions or behaviors as unacceptable, backing down later becomes politically costly. Rival powers sensing this rigidity may probe the edges to test resolve. Each test increases the risk of miscalculation. History is filled with examples where signaling strength was meant to prevent conflict but ended up accelerating it. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the overlap between economic and military domains. In the past, trade disputes and security conflicts were often separate tracks. Today, they are intertwined. Sanctions can cripple economies, cyber operations can disrupt infrastructure, and control over payment systems can function like a weapon. A doctrine that explicitly links economic dominance with security enforcement raises the stakes of every negotiation. When losing a trade dispute feels like losing strategic ground, compromise becomes harder. As we move closer to 2026, the real question is not whether the Donroe Doctrine exists as an official document, but whether its logic shapes policy decisions. Investors, policymakers, and ordinary citizens should pay attention not just to speeches, but to patterns. Where is capital flowing? Which industries are being prioritized? How are alliances being redefined? These are the signals that reveal whether a collision course is being plotted quietly beneath the surface of daily headlines, because